Fellows this year. Even as we live in times when headlines are filled with reports about the latest atrocities of extremist groups like ISIS, Boko Haram, or the Al-Nusra Front, the idea that terrorism does not work is one that we hear echoed by governments around the world. However, there are episodes in history that seem to suggest otherwise. On July 22, 1946, 7 milk churns containing concealed bombs exploded in the basement of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. 92 people were killed. What was at the time the most lethal terrorist attack in history was perpetrated by a Zionist paramilitary organization with the main goal of forcing the British out of Palestine. Less than 2 years later, the British were gone and the state of Israel was in existence. The terrorists had seemingly succeeded in achieving their political objective. This evening, drawing from his latest book, our speaker will chronicle the battles between Jews, Arabs, and the British that led to the creation of Israel. Bruce Hoffman is a professor at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, where he is also the director of both the Center for Security Studies and of the Security Studies Masters of Arts program. He has been studying terrorism and insurgency for nearly 4 decades. Appointed by the US Congress to serve as a commissioner on the Independent Commission to review the FBI's post-9/11 response to terrorism and radicalization, Professor Hoffman was a lead author of the commission's final report. A prolific author, Professor Hoffman's recent books include The Evolution of the Global Terrorist Threat from 9/11 to Osama bin Laden's death, and Anonymous Soldiers, The Struggle for Israel, 1917 to 1947, which is based on newly available documents from the British, Israeli, and US archives. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording is strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bruce Hoffman to the Athenaeum.
Thank you, Sven, for the very kind introduction, and Henrietta as well, for hosting me, Priya, and of course my dear old friend Jenny Taw. This is actually my second visit to the Athenaeum. I was here 3 years ago, so I'm tremendously honored and delighted to have been invited back. I'm going to do something a little different tonight, and I hope it works. I don't think there's an author in the world that doesn't believe every word they've written is a jewel valued beyond human computation. And when the hardcover of my book, Anonymous Soldiers, came out last year, I just gave a straight talk, and doubtless it was fascinating and riveting to the audience. But I thought this time in this new version that it's insufficient just to speak, that people should also be entertained, if not captured, and visually. That's a very good way to do so. So this is a new version of the talk, and I hope it's successful, that actually uses photographs from the book to try to illustrate the talk. Now, I had a dry run of this last week, and I didn't use notes, and my wife was in the audience, and any of you who have spouses or even siblings know that they're often your toughest audience. And my wife said that I went on too long and I became too enraptured in the photographs and no one could really follow me. So I'm going to try to both show the photographs and use them to illustrate my points, but also more or less stick to a script, so at least I don't go on nearly as long as I did last week. So let me tell you a little bit how I came to write this book and why I came to write this book. And Sven, in his very kind introduction, already illuminated a bit of that. I'm not a Middle Eastern or a Zionist historian, so that's not my perspective. I've studied terrorism now for 40 years. Literally, this 2016 marks the 40th anniversary of when I first went to graduate school and had an interest in this subject. And the question that's always perplexed me during these 4 decades is that, throughout the world, governments, and certainly the victims of terrorism, maintain that it's a failed strategy and that it's a distinctively unsuccessful means of achieving fundamental political change. But at the same time, there's an intrinsic paradox, because at the end of the day, terrorism has lasted for more than 2 millennia. And if it's that ineffective and that much of a failed strategy, how do we account for its persistence? And not only how do we account for its persistence, but looking at the 21st century, one very sadly and depressingly has to admit that terrorism has become, it seems to have become only more intractable and an even more indelible feature of conflict in this century than in previous ones. And that was one of the reasons, or perhaps the main reason, why I decided to write this book, because I thought the only way to really answer the question of whether terrorism, whether political violence and force works to achieve fundamental political change, is to take an in-depth look at a key case study. And the events that led to the British withdrawal from Palestine, which had been ruled by Britain since 1917, some years later under a mandate given to it by the League of Nations to prepare Palestine for eventual independence, and that led to the creation of Israel, seemed to be an ideal case study. And I say it's an ideal case study because of some of the things that Sven talked about, in the sense that there's a vast volume of archival material that can be consulted, that one can drill down, I think, to an almost unprecedented level of detail in assessing, literally on a day-to-day basis, how British government and policy making was affected by both Arab and Jewish violence in Palestine. There are additional archival sources in the United States that more often than not, reflected and validated a lot of the things that one found in the British archives. And in addition, there's archival materials in the United Kingdom, in Israel as well. So, you know, thank you very much. Oops, just, it's great. And I've always, in my academic career, I've sort of straddled history and political science and been mostly in international relations. And one of the things I noticed in the past 15 years is that a lot of political science work on what I thought were very thin case studies made fairly lavish judgments on how terrorism and political violence affected government decision-making, I thought on very thin evidence. But yet when you have access to the archives, and especially archives in multiple countries, you can triangulate, you can validate, and I have to say one of the proudest achievements, but one reason also that has padded out the book Anonymous Soldiers, is that I have multiple citations and sources for for every fact that I offered, gleaned from these archival sources. So that was really the impetus, is to take this deep dive. And one thing I'll say before launching into the substance is that it's a very fat book. It's over 600 pages. If you can imagine, it was nearly double. The version that I submitted to my editor, I guess it's now 3 years ago, was nearly double that size. I spent a year cutting out almost half of that. It's not like when, you know, writing is creating, is giving birth to something. Editing and cutting is like killing. It was very painful. And also, one would think that you cutting out 150,000 words, you get another book, but it's a very humbling experience, because what you realize is just how much fat that you had padded out a book and how much extraneous material there was. So I actually should have listened to my editor and cut even more out, but that was an impossibility. So just to orient you, I mean, this was the way Palestine looked in 1946, which is one of the key years in the book. This is Jerusalem, where a lot of the story takes place. The King David Hotel is featured there, and here's Palestine, in essence, the West Bank, as well as what is today the State of Israel, but also including the Gaza Strip. So really, I think, to understand how the role of violence and terrorism in Israel's creation, one equally has to understand the other side of that coin. And that's how terrorism and violence, coming from both Arabs and Jews, affected British policy in decision-making in Palestine. Now, this is one of the most iconic photographs. Many of these photographs I found in the archives haven't been published before. This one, though, has often been published. This is the iconic scene of General Sir Edmund Allenby entering Jerusalem, entering the Old City through the Jaffa Gate on December 7th, 1917. And to me, this is a fascinating photograph. Firstly, the scene looks remarkably similar. There's Jaffa Gate. This building is still standing. The British found the Ottoman clock tower unsightly, so have knocked down the clock tower. But what's interesting about this particular photograph is that in an era long before Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, before 24/7 cable news, This was an orchestrated, choreographed event. Some weeks before British forces seized Jerusalem, General Allenby received a telegram from his commander, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, Britain's equivalent during World War I of what today would be the American chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Field Marshal Lord Robertson, who said something to him to this effect, that when Jerusalem is conquered, prefer that you enter on foot rather than mounted. 10 years ago, Kaiser Wilhelm visited Jerusalem, and the word went round the world that a lesser man than he walked. Obvious comparison is clear. So here, Lord Robertson was referring to Kaiser Wilhelm's famous visit to Jerusalem in the 1890s, when actually a hole was cut, or a passageway was cut in the Jaffa Gate so he could ride in on horseback. And here was a choreographed attempt to show British humility in establishing its rule over the Holy Land and over Jerusalem. In the next photograph, you see Allenby reading out the proclamation announcing British rule, and this is in front of David Citadel. That's the Petra Hotel, which is still a hotel. This scene is exactly the same in present-day Jerusalem. The proclamation was read out in Palestine's 6 official languages: Arabic, Hebrew, English, Russian, French, and Greek. And here, I think, at the very beginning of British rule, we see the problem, the paradox that really undermined the rest of Britain's governance of Palestine. And the problem was that Britain never really had a firm or consistent policy for Palestine. And this created the impression on both sides that British policy could be influenced by violence. And I think the reason Britain never had a firm or consistent policy of Palestine is that even before General Allenby marched into the city, before British forces conquered Jerusalem, Britain had made conflicting pledges to both Palestine's Arab and Jewish inhabitants. In 1915, Sir Henry McMahon, the High Commissioner of Egypt, had entered into a correspondence with Sheriff Hussein of Mecca, the leader of what was then the Arabian Peninsula, where in return for Sheriff Hussein's support in overthrowing the yoke of Ottoman rule, because of course the Ottoman Empire and Turkey was allied with the Central Powers, with Germany and Austria-Hungary, that in return for Sheriff Hussein's support in overthrowing Ottoman rule and joining the Allied powers side, Britain pledged to grant independence to all those territories hitherto ruled by the Ottoman Empire. All well and good, but then 2 years later, almost exactly a month before Allenby marches into Palestine, Britain issues the Balfour Declaration, which was in fact a note sent by the Foreign Secretary, Lord Balfour, to Lord Rothschild, one of the presidents of the British Zionist Association, where Britain committed to facilitate the establishment in Palestine of a Jewish national home. And sure enough, shortly after British rule commenced, Britain made good on that pledge and began to allow Jewish immigration to Palestine. It was not long, though, before the Arabs in Palestine concluded that even though the amount of Jews entering Palestine was really a trickle, there was no restrictions on Jewish immigration, the numbers were extremely small. Even by 1921, only about 6% of Palestine's population were Jewish, and many of those people were part of centuries-old Jewish communities. But the first influx of these new immigrants under British rule almost immediately provoked Arab fears of their country being overrun by Jews. And this translated into the first widespread protests that very rapidly deteriorated into rioting. And in 1920, riots convulsed Jerusalem. Order was restored, and then once again in 1921, there was a new round of riots. In this case, these riots began in Tel Aviv itself and the adjacent Arab city of Jaffa. But unlike the Jerusalem disturbances the month before that had remained pretty much confined to the old city, the violence in 1921 rapidly spread outside of Tel Aviv and Jaffa and engulfed the surrounding countryside. And in the aftermath of those riots, the British made two very fateful decisions that had totally inadvertent consequences. Firstly, they held a conference. It was called the 1921 Jerusalem Conference. These are some of the main participants in the conference. That's Winston Churchill, obviously went on to great fame as the prime minister during World War II, but then was actually the colonial secretary. Right there is the famed Lawrence of Arabia, T. Lawrence. To my knowledge, this photograph has never been published before. I found it in a personal papers collection in a small, relatively small archive in Oxford. And that's the future King Abdullah of Jordan, one of Sheriff Hussein's sons, actually, who was set up by Britain as being the ruler of what was then the newly created territory or kingdom of Transjordan, known today as Jordan. And as a result of this conference, there were two seminal developments. The first one is that for the first time, the British decided that henceforth Jewish immigration would be determined on the basis of Palestine's quote-unquote economic absorptive capacity. In other words, that Jewish immigrants would only be admitted dependent on a formula that was not communicated completely transparency, that the British would determine, and that would limit Jewish immigration. And this, it was hoped, would mollify Arab discontent and assuage their fears that the country would be overrun by Jews. In point of fact, it had something to the opposite effect. It rather sent a message that the British were susceptible to being persuaded to having their policies influenced or changed by violence. And that point was reiterated by sort of the second inadvertent mistake. And that was the appointment of, not so much the appointment of the first High Commissioner, but the decision of the first High Commissioner. The first High Commissioner for Palestine was a very noted Anglo-Zionist, a Jew, Sir Herbert Samuel, had been extremely active in the British Labour Party, had served in a variety of very high positions in the British government, in fact, had been in both Lord Asquith's cabinet at the start of World War I, and at one of the few who lasted, was also in Lloyd George's cabinet at the end of World War I, had been one of the moving forces behind the Balfour Declaration. Doubtless, he was very conscious of his own religion, of his own role in the Balfour Declaration. And in order to emphasize his impartiality, his equanimity in terms of mediating between both sides, he made the second fateful decision. And that was to pardon an individual that had been sentenced to 15 years imprisonment following the 1920 riots. And that person was someone named Haj Amin al-Husseini. Haj Amin al-Husseini is one of the fascinating characters that appears in the book. The son of one of the two most prominent families in Palestine, the two dominant families even to this day are the al-Husseinis and the al-Nashashibis. Yasser Arafat, for instance, is descended from the al-Husseini family. Haj Amin himself was educated at the seat of Islamic learning at the Al-Azhar Mosque and University in Cairo. Even as a student in Cairo in the 1890s, he established a reputation of being a committed Arab nationalist, as one who was very fearful that even the very modest immigration that had been allowed of Jews during this first and second aliyot under the Ottoman Sultan to come to Palestine in the 1880s and 1890s had excited his own fears that the country would be overrun in Jews. And as a student at Al-Azhar, he formed a student organization to protest that. Not surprisingly, he served with the Ottoman army during World War I. And then afterwards, a man of devout piety and learning. In many respects, Hajj was a title of someone who had made the pilgrimage, but was implicated in the 1920 riots, as I said, and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. And as an overture in the aftermath of the 1921 riots, in hopes again of mollifying and assuaging Arab concerns, Samuel made the decision not only to pardon Haj Amin Husseini, but to appoint him to the highest representative post of Palestine's Muslims, to appoint him Mufti of Jerusalem, in other words, the spiritual leader of Palestine's Muslim community. Haj Amin was not a modest man. He actually styled himself the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. There was no title Grand Mufti. It's just, even today, there's a Mufti of Jerusalem. But he went that one further. But also, secondarily, Samuel also created the post of President of the Supreme Muslim Council, so made him also the political leader of Palestine's Muslim community. And I would have to say that Haj Amin was really at the vortex of all the major turning points in both the Arab and Jewish communities' relationships with Britain, and often at the most violent turning points. Parenthetically, I'll say that Haj Amin was exiled from Palestine in 1938, never returned to the country after World War II, was actually hunted as a war criminal, eventually, in part because of his collaboration with the Nazis. In fact, one of the fascinating documents that I found at the U.S. National Archives in conjunction with the research in this book was a list of the highest paid preeminent figures in the Third Reich, and Haj Amin al-Husseini was paid more than Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox, but never returned to Palestine and died in exile in 1974 in Beirut. But he was also one of the architects, again, rather than moderating him, I mean, he had led a dual life. On the one hand, he was responsible to the British government to represent the Palestinians and the Arabs. On the other hand, one has to say that he never lost his faith in the efficacy of violence. And I think Haj Amin Husseini's key role goes beyond even the events in Palestine. The events in Palestine, really, was that throughout the 1920s, he achieved for the first time of a phenomenon that we see very commonly today across many religions, and that's the fusion of nationalism with religion, where theological imperatives become a justification, a legitimization for the pursuit of political aims. And it was really that melding of these forces that produced the next major outburst of violence in Palestine, and that was the 1929 riots. And these were riots that swept through the entire country, that resulted in almost the elimination of the Jewish community in Hebron and Safat, Jewish communities of piety and learning that had been there for centuries. But the violence was indiscriminate and occurred all over the country. And for the British, represented a very formidable challenge to its authority. In response, rather than another conference, Britain convened the first of 22 commissions that over the next 18 years would visit Palestine and attempt to divine a political solution to the conflicting Arab and Jewish claims to the country. In this case, as a result of this commission's work, a white paper, yet another white paper, was promulgated by the British government. This was known as the Passfield White Paper, after the then colonial secretary, Lord Passfield. And this, for the first time, promulgated very serious restrictions on both Jewish immigration and land purchase. In fact, it amounted to a reversal of the Balfour Declaration. Now, in this case, the Zionists were very effective in marshaling their friends and lobbying for the British government for a change in this policy. And what is henceforth been known in the Palestinian Arab community is the MacDonald Black Letter, in reference to the then Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald. Astonishingly, Ramsay MacDonald basically repudiated his own cabinet secretary. I mean, an official within his own cabinet, the colonial secretary, reversed the Passfield White Paper, and no restrictions were imposed on Jewish immigration or land purchase. Well, what happens in the next few years, of course, is within 3 years, Hitler himself is appointed Chancellor of Germany. And in 1933 alone, 6 times the number of Jews emigrate to Palestine than over the past 10 years combined. In fact, between 1933 and 1936, the Jewish population of Palestine expands exponentially. In fact, from about, as I said earlier, about 6% of the population in 1921 to about 25% of the population in 1936. And not surprisingly, this engenders even more Arab resistance to this influx of immigrants who are reading the handwriting on the wall of the situation in Europe. And in 1936, a much more sustained and systemic rebellion breaks out in Palestine. Unlike the previous disturbances, which were almost entirely directed against the Jewish community, both old and new, old established Jewish communities and ones of new immigrants, this rebellion was directed as much against the British. And of course, for the British, as the Arab rebellion drags on, through 1936, into 1937, into 1938. This presents enormous difficulties. Literally on the eve of World War II, Britain has 40,000 troops tied up maintaining order in Palestine. Even though the Munich Agreement in September 1938 postpones the inevitability of war breaking out, British strategists and government officials are extremely cognizant of the fact that should war break out, and especially should Italy side with Nazi Germany against Britain, the Italian fleet could move to cut off British access to the Suez Canal and thus the lifeline to the British Empire in India and the Far East. In that eventuality, troops would have to be rushed overland from India and elsewhere, in Iraq in particular, and other British mandates, to cross through Palestine into the Sinai to reopen the Suez Canal. And the British were convinced that if there's an outright rebellion going on in Palestine, the rapid movement of troops would be impeded by that violence. Also, with the advent of war now inevitable in Europe, the forces pinned down suppressing an internal insurrection in Palestine will be needed to defend Britain should they go to war in Germany. So as a result of that, the British in 1938 and then in 1939 moved to promulgate a new policy for Palestine that will finally bring peace to the country. And that peace is to be bought at the expense of Britain's commitment to the Jews is embodied in the Balfour Declaration. The 1939 White Paper, enacted in May 1939, firstly imposes severe restrictions on Jewish immigration. In fact, it says that henceforth, Jewish immigration to Palestine will be prohibited unless the Arab population of the country consents to that. Very low likelihood that would occur. However, in reflection of the dire needs of European Jewry, who have seen many of their routes to salvation closed off on the eve of World War II, the British allowed that over the next 5 years, a total of 75,000 Jews would be allowed to immigrate to Palestine as a gesture of goodwill. But after that, there would be no immigration allowed unless the Arabs consented to it. In addition to that, stringent restrictions were imposed on Jewish land purchase in the entirety of Palestine. In fact, only 5% of the entirety of that map that I showed you of Palestine would be available for any Jewish purchase of land. So this really resulted in a repudiation of the Balfour Declaration. And the problem is that much over the preceding 2 decades, as the Arabs had drawn their own conclusions from the violence they had instigated that had compelled Britain to adjust, adapt, and ultimately change its policy for Palestine, the Jewish population, or at least a segment of the Jewish population, came to the same conclusion. Already in the aftermath of the 1929 riots, a small group of Jews had concluded that entirely defensive measures were no longer appropriate given the rising threat of Arab violence in Palestine. And in 1931, a small group of members belonging to the Haganah, which in Hebrew literally means defense, which was the Jewish self-defense militia, actually the embryonic encapsulation of what eventually became the Israel Defense Forces, broke away and resolved that in the event of renewed Arab violence, they would assume the biblical admonition of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and retaliate for Arab violence. And this group called itself the Irgun Tzvai Leumi, or National Military Organization. You can see from the somewhat stylized version of its logo, it's a rifle, clasping a rifle, actually encompassing both sides of the River Jordan, being meant to reflect both Palestine and Transjordan, and its motto was Rak Kach, which is Hebrew for only thus, so only through force of arms. And between 1937 and 1939, the Irgun engaged in violence very similar to the violence that the Arabs were inflicting on the Jews. I mean, tit for tat, acts of violence involving tactics such as shootings of trains and buses, bombings of marketplaces, the exact same type of violence. However, with Britain's announcement of the White Paper, the Irgun changed tacks. And in their propaganda, they make the statement, the Arabs are using violence and are winning. It's time for Jews to use the same violence. And in May 1939, the Irgun announces that it is revolting against, or in revolt against, British rule. The revolt, though, is short-lived because, of course, only a matter of months later, the world is at war. Britain's at war with Nazi Germany. On September 1st, Germany invades Poland. 2 days later, Britain, because of its treaty obligations to Poland, declares war on Germany. And the entire Jewish community in Palestine rallies around the British war effort and decides to support the British against the greater menace of the Nazis rather than to prosecute this struggle for statehood. However, a small group within the Irgun differs. And they form a group that at the time eventually adopts the name Lehi, which is an acronym for Freedom Fighters for Israel, more colloquially known to the British as the Stern Gang, named after its founder and leader, Avraham Stern, who had been a senior officer in the Irgun. Now, Stern, like Haj Amin Husseini, is an infinitely, at least in my view, fascinating character. I mean, how do you describe him? He's someone who was a poet and a scholar, a dandy and a womanizer, a dreamer and a zealot. He turned his back on a very promising academic career as a classicist. In fact, he was one of the most talented students studying ancient Greek and Latin at the Hebrew University in the 1930s. But he was zealously committed to the cause of Jewish statehood. And in this respect, he was also a student of history. And I think this is a phenomena that, at least in my 4 decades of studying terrorism, I've seen repeatedly, is that terrorists often learn from one another and study the experiences, the struggles, the wars of national liberation, the campaigns of their predecessors. One of the problems I've always seen is that governments are much less adept at consistently studying these lessons and often have to reinvent the wheel from the start. So Stern was not only a student of ancient history, of the Zealots, of the Maccabees, of the events at Masada, but also he focused very much on the British experience during World War I, when Irish nationalists, in the midst of World War I, and the 100th anniversary is coming up in the next few weeks of the Easter Uprising in April 1916, when Irish nationalists rose up while Britain was preoccupied with World War I, decided to attempt to wrest control of their destiny. And this was exactly Stern's dream. His conclusion is that there was no difference between the British, who closed the gates of Palestine to Jews seeking salvation, or the Germans that persecuted them. And he decided that in this particular condition, or this particular circumstance, that the Jews could ally themselves with Germany and kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Through this alliance, offer Hitler an answer to the Jewish problem, a solution to the Jewish problem, where Hitler could allow all the Jews to emigrate to Palestine and to join in rising up and destroying the British Empire. I mean, much of this was fanciful and half-baked. I think a lot of it was predicated on 2 things. Firstly, in 1939, 1940, there were any number of death squads exterminating Jews in the borderlands of Russia and the Ukraine and Poland and elsewhere. The final solution, as it crystallized at the Wannsee Conference in 1942, had yet to be known. But even more importantly, Stern's own family was trapped behind in Poland. And I think part of this was born of his desperate efforts to try to secure passage for his family. And in 1940, Stern, fascinatingly, as the book recounts, attempting to enter into an alliance with Nazi Germany. In fact, he sent an emissary to Beirut to meet with the German ambassador there and to forge ties with the Gestapo to put this fantastical plan to them. British intelligence was all over this. The emissary was intercepted at the border, was arrested, and nothing became of this. But one of the fascinating, and this is, for obvious reasons, this is a very controversial aspect of Jewish and Zionist history that has been well known, but the exact details of it, I would argue, until my book, really weren't explicated. And one of the most fascinating documents I found in the American archives was a memo written by FDR's Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, following a meeting he had with the Polish ambassador in exile, where they both discussed American intelligence reports of Stern's mad scheme, and both expressed concern that within the British Empire there were these elements that were seeking to make some sort of a truce or some sort of alliance with Britain's and America's enemies. Nothing ever came of this. Stern himself was shot to death by British police in 1942. And I have to say that in the book, although the Stern gang Lehi play a part, in terms of influencing British policy, they were mostly inconsequential, except in one very important incident. And this was the assassination on November 6, 1944, of Lord Moyne. Lord Moyne was the heir to the Guinness fortune. So those of you who drink Guinness beer, his real name was Brian Guinness, in fact. More to the point, he was a member of the British cabinet, was the senior British official responsible for the Middle East. He was also a very close political ally of Churchill's and one of Winston Churchill's closest friends. Because of his position being in charge of British policy, he was targeted by Lehi for assassination. And the person that targeted him, and I hope I'm going to get this right, yes. This is the original Facebook, right? You all have Facebook on your computers. This is the original Facebook. This is actually a notebook, one of the things that I found in a very small archive in Britain, not in the official archives, but actually in Rhodes House Library at Oxford University. You can see it looks like a filofax, if any of you remember what a filofax was, right? In fact, this is a precursor of the filofax. And basically, these are photographs of all the Jewish terrorists or suspected terrorists that the British secret police carried with them in Palestine, that often they would assemble, they would descend on a community. They used to do the same thing during the Arab Rebellion. The police would line up all the members of that community in front of that neighborhood in front of them, and the police would sit there flipping through these books, interrogating the people in front of them and hoping to recognize them. And this individual was in fact captured exactly in this manner in 1946, and his name here is Itzhak Wisniewski. That's his Polish name. He's probably better known to many of you as a future foreign minister and prime minister of Israel, Itzhak Shamir. And Itzhak Shamir was the operations chief of the Lehi and actually dispatched the two assassins to murder Lord Moyne. He was also a student of the Irish Rebellion. In fact, his underground name in Palestine was Michal, the Hebrew for Michael, named in honor of Michael Collins, of course, his counterpart, the chief of operations for the IRA. If you've seen the film Michael Collins, that's who Liam Neeson plays. But the tragedy of Moyne's assassination is really that this was, to me, depressingly one of these lost opportunities perhaps to arrive at a peaceful settlement of the Arab and Jews' conflicting claims to Palestine. Winston Churchill, throughout his entire political career, had been a friend of the Jews. When he was first elected to Parliament at the turn of 2 centuries ago in Manchester, it was a large Jewish constituency that impelled him to office. It was his own political party, the Conservatives, that had enacted the 1939 White Paper. Churchill was always an implacable opponent of the White Paper. And once he became prime minister, and once he was confident that the tide of war was turning in the Allies' favor, in 1943, he convened a special committee of the British cabinet to evolve a solution to the Palestine problem. And this committee was slated to recommend that Palestine be partitioned into separate Jewish and Arab states. Now, Churchill's plan was very ambitious. He hoped to enlist President Roosevelt's support for this and also Marshal Stalin's. In fact, Churchill's vision was that the third Big Three conference would not be held in Yalta, as it actually was in February 1945, but would actually take place in Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, he would secure the agreement of the United States and Britain to this solution that hopefully would resolve these conflicting claims to Palestine by partitioning the country, exactly as the United Nations did 4 years later into separate Jewish and Arab states. In fact, on November 5th, to show you how close this was, on November 5th, at Chequers, the prime ministerial retreat outside of London, Churchill entertained for Sunday lunch Chaim Weizmann, the president of the Zionist Association. And there they discussed this impending plan that was about to be publicized and released by the British cabinet to partition Palestine. And in the book, it relates how Weizmann expressed concerns that the Jewish state that was proposed would be too small to be economically viable. And Churchill hastens to comfort him and says to him, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, that, look, I have put all of our friends on this cabinet committee. that I can assure you it will be a viable Jewish state and that you will be able to stick your thumb in this pie and pull out a plum piece. But, he says, before we can publicly announce it, we have to wait until Tuesday, when President Roosevelt hopefully will be elected to his 4th term in office, and then I could immediately enlist his support and subsequently persuade Marshal Stalin. What happened on the next day, on Monday? That's November 6th, and that's the day Lord Moyne was assassinated. And with Lord Moyne's assassination, Churchill completely turns his back on the prospect of partition. His old friend, political ally, is killed, cut down in the smoke of assassins' pistols, and yet another in a long line of lost opportunities that tragically have continued till today is missed. Here's another photograph from the original Facebook, and this photograph is of Menachem Begin, another future prime minister of Israel, also a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, the future leader of the Irgun Tzvai Leumi, the national military organization. And Begin is another, I think, endlessly fascinating character. He was born in 1904 in Brest-Litovsk, a backwater, then at the confluence of Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. Begin grew up in an environment that was infused with anti-Semitism. In fact, one of his earliest memories as a child is of accompanying his father to the market, and his father, they're walking down the street, and his father comes upon a Polish soldier with a bayonet, with a very blunt bayonet, who's trying to hack off the beard of a very devout Hasidic Jewish rabbi. And Begin said he always remembered how his father, completely heedless of his own security and his own safety, intervened to try to save this rabbi. The Polish soldier, of course, shoved Begin's father out of the way. In those days, people wore top hats and carried walking sticks. Begin's father struck the Polish soldier with his walking stick. Of course, the Polish police and other soldiers watching this, laughing until then, immediately descended on both the rabbi and Begin's father, beat them both senseless and hauled them off to jail. And this had a lasting impression on Begin that you always had to defend your own people. At age 15, Begin joined a nationalist youth organization. He had superb oratorial skills, and even as a teenager rose very rapidly through its ranks. I'll say parenthetically, we often look today in the commonalities of why people become terrorists or how people are attracted to radical politics and talk about education, background, friendships. Begin, much like Stern, was a very gifted classicist, was very skilled and very talented in ancient Greek and Latin. Not that that's necessarily a commonality that leads to political violence, but it's fascinating. These were two. Often we think of terrorists as very poor, uneducated individuals. I mean, Haj Amin Husseini was from a very wealthy, distinguished family, was educated at one of the seats of Islamic learning. Begin studied at the University of Warsaw and had a law degree, and Stern, as I said, graduated the equivalent of summa cum laude from Hebrew University in the classics. But what I think really distinguished Begin is because of his oratorial skills, he rose in the propaganda department of what was then the revisionist movement, or Beitar, and was someone who always understood the power of communications. And that, I think, is really the strength that he brought to the Irgun, is he understood violence as communication. He arrived in Palestine in 1943, assumed command of the Irgun at the end of that year, and in 1944 resumed the revolt at a time that the war in Britain, at least he believed, had been decided. Now, Begin's strategy was not to defeat the British militarily. He understood that a small group of zealots, of fanatics using terrorist tactics couldn't hope to defeat the might of the British Empire, but rather he used daring, dramatic, spectacular acts of violence that were choreographed not just to the immediate audience in the locus of conflict, but were choreographed to appeal to, in essence, a global audience. And what he sought to do was to undermine the government's prestige and control of Palestine by striking at symbols of British rule. I mean, this is a photograph of a successful attack against the British police headquarters in Jerusalem. Perhaps the most famous attack of the Irgun was the one mentioned in the introduction, which was the bombing in July 22nd, 1946 of the King David Hotel. This is one of the cover photos of the book. Now, let me make one very important point. This was the King David Hotel in 1946 was not an ordinary hostelry. In fact, only a very small portion of it, only about 15 to 20% of it was actually used for guests. Actually, the King David Hotel in 1946, as it had since 1938, housed the nerve center of British rule in Palestine. In its southern wing, which is exactly what the Irgun bombed, was the government secretariat, so the machinery of the British government that administered Palestine. It was also British military headquarters for Palestine and Transjordan was also located in the hotel. And on the two uppermost floors were the headquarters of British intelligence for the Middle East. So from Begin's point of view, this was a legitimate military target. Of course, in the tragedy that ensued, 91 persons were killed, the majority of whom were innocent civilians, Arab, Jew, and Briton alike. But Begin's strategy capitalized on the fact that on this paradox that the more pervasive British security had to be, the roadblocks, the snap checks, the barbed wire, the more powerful the terrorists themselves appeared as well. And the Irgun struggle was really the first post-World War II war of national liberation to successfully use spectacular acts of violence to appeal to an international audience. So in this sense, in an era long before 24/7 news coverage, the Irgun deliberately sought to appeal to a worldwide audience, an audience beyond the footlights in Palestine, in the British capital in London, in Paris, in Moscow, in Washington, and importantly, New York, not because of New York's large Jewish population, but because New York was the seat of the fledgling United Nations. And Begin very early understood that the United Nations would play a very important mediating role in these types of conflicts. And Begin deliberately sought to influence the United Nations. And I think one of the marks of his success is that when the 22nd Commission arrived in Palestine in June 1947, a special United Nations committee on Palestine, Begin was granted 2 audiences with them to put forth the Irgun's case. So here I think to understand the events and the role of Jewish terrorism in the events that led to the withdrawal of Britain from Palestine and the creation of Israel, one has to see what Begin in particular did was using this type of violence as an accelerant to hasten an existent process, to leave Britain with fewer options and less time to dispose of what had become the violence-plagued mandate of Palestine. And one of the striking things in the book I found is that up until the very end, the British were determined to hold on to Palestine. Even though, for military basing rights, even though they had granted independence to India, they were still convinced that they required access to the Suez Canal because even though they didn't have their empire in the Far East, the dominions would be the lifeblood of British commerce and would enable Britain to emerge from the economic travails that it experienced during World War II. So basically, I think, in conclusion, history is rarely monocausal. And even as a student of terrorism studies, or a student of the history of terrorism, I mean, it would be completely disingenuous if I said it was an act of terrorism that led to World War I. We know that there were any number of factors that led to World War I, the Anglo-German trade rivalry, the Anglo-German naval rivalry, the entangling alliances between Britain, France, and Russia, and Germany, Austria-Hungary, and in turn, the Ottoman Empire. Certainly it was Russia's ambitions to create a pan-Slavic empire in the Balkans as the Ottoman Empire decayed. At the same time, it was the Habsburg Empire's imperialist ambitions in the Balkans that also set in motion the chain of events that led to World War I. But at the same time, we acknowledge that the fuse was lit with an act of terrorism, with the assassination of the heir to the Habsburg throne, Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo in June 1914. And I think that's also how we have to view the chain of events that led to Britain's withdrawal and to the establishment of the State of Israel. Certainly the rise of Israel was, of course, a product of any number of very powerful forces in addition to terrorism. Diplomacy, negotiation, lobbying, civil disobedience, information operations, all undertaken by far more moderate Zionist entities than the extremists in the Irgun and Lehi. Clearly, the plight of survivors of the Holocaust, the hundreds of thousands of displaced persons that were still languishing in detention camps 2 or 3 years after World War II in Europe was an enormous factor. And then one also has to factor into the role that President Truman himself played against the advice of his State Department, against the counsel of his own Secretary of State, George Marshall. Truman supported the creation of Israel. At the same time, though, I think the Irgun's success in attracting attention to themselves and their cause did play a pivotal role in hastening Britain's withdrawal from Palestine in 1948. And I thought one of the most interesting documents that I found in the book was a reminiscence written by the Colonial Secretary at the time, Arthur Creech Jones, who 16 years later reflected on the events that impelled Britain to surrender in the Mandate. And he said there were 4. First, the intractability of Arab and Jewish political differences and conflicting claims to Palestine that Britain found itself unable to resolve after 3 decades of trying. Second was Britain's post-war economic travails and its reduced finances and indebtedness to the United Nations. Britain had, because of the Irgun's campaign, 100,000 troops in Palestine. Remember, during the Arab Rebellion, which was a far more extensive uprising, they only had 40,000 troops. So maintaining 100,000 troops in Palestine was enormously expensive. Third was the failure to enlist American support in resolving these conflicting claims and the inability of the post-war Labor government to come up with an alternative to the 1939 White Paper policy. And fourth, and Creech Jones considered equally important, was the terrorist activities of the Irgun that undermined Britain's commitment to Palestine, that turned popular opinion in the United Kingdom away from Britain remaining in Palestine for even 1 day longer than was necessary. So thank you very much, and happy to answer any questions. One thing I left out, the title of the book, Anonymous Soldiers, comes from a poem that Avraham Stern wrote that subsequently became the theme song of the Irgun and then of the Lehi.
We now have time for questions, so if you have one, please raise your hand and Shwan or I will come to you.
Hello. My question is, what do you believe, after having studied the creation of Israel for so long and terrorism for so long, would lead to, this is kind of a big question, but lead to stability, if not peace, in solving the current conflict? Or what do you see would be a good step?
Well, this goes to the heart of what I think animated violence in Palestine, for the past 100 years or more, is that I think in the absence of discernible progress towards a solution, the impatience and the emotions that take hold drive both sides to embrace violence as a solution. And I think, part of the problem is that, at least the perpetrators of terrorism believe it's successful until we can convince them that it's not successful. But they point to any number of historical examples. I don't think Israel is unique. The events that gave birth to Kenya, for example, as a result of the Mau Mau uprising. The events that gave birth to the British withdrawal of Cyprus, for example, and resulted in the Republic of Cyprus. I mean, these are cases where these struggles actually did have an effect on governments. I think that, some of the lessons that emerge from the book is, I think, the sort of tactics that are needed to counter terrorism, which is, firstly, recognizing the budding signs of violence and of polarization. I mean, unfortunately, this was one of the strategies that all sides used, was to use violence to prompt a response from the government that would alienate the community. that in the government's frustration to get information would impact ordinary people I described earlier. Whether it was Arabs or Jews, the British would descend on communities, line everybody up, completely disrupt daily life and economy, create conditions of martial law, and that this disruption made the populations resent the omnipresent, the visible security forces, and not so much blame the invisible terrorists who emerged from the shadows to strike and then disappeared. So it's that strategy of polarization that is being constantly repeated, which means that there has to be dynamic processes to arrive at political solutions as early as possible in the surfacing of these conflicts.
Thanks so much for your talk. I'm curious because you touched on what Begin and his compatriots found inspiration for some of their methods. So I'm wondering how their efforts influenced terrorism patterns and methodology after 1947.
Right, well, I don't want to give away the last line in the book, but that's really the best way to answer this. When United States military forces invaded Afghanistan in November 2001 and overran al-Qaeda's former headquarters in Kandahar, they found in al-Qaeda's extraordinarily well-stocked library a copy of Begin's seminal text, The Revolt, Story of the Irgun, as well as many other books about the Irgun and the Lehi. And even more so, when Ayman al-Zawahiri's HP laptop was found, Hewlett-Packard laptop, there was a separate file on Irgun. Now, I don't think bin Laden and Zawahiri were seeking to learn terrorist tactics from these groups. Rather, what their interest was is how terrorist groups like the Irgun made the transition from being underground movements to bona fide political parties. Because, of course, Begin himself, after the British left, served 30 years in opposition in the Knesset, in the parliament. He formed the group, the Herut Party or the Freedom Party, that eventually went into an alliance with, I would say, predecessors to the Likud. The Likud now is very different. In fact, Benny Begin, Begin's son, and Benjamin Netanyahu are arch rivals, or are not even on speaking terms, in fact. So, tracing a direct trajectory is often difficult. But the point I want to make is that perhaps more worrisomely, bin Laden was very interested in how he could refashion al-Qaeda into something more respectable. And that was the reason he was studying them. So this is exactly the point, is that when you look at this particular period, the National Liberation Front's revolt against French rule in Algeria in 1950 bears remarkable resemblance to exactly the strategy that Begin implemented, right down to the deliberate appeal to the United Nations and to opinion in America. General Grievous, who was the commander of the resistance forces, the terrorist groups in Cyprus, for example, his books, General Grievous on Guerrilla Warfare and On Guerrilla Warfare, I mean, they're plagiarized. I mean, they literally appear that they've plagiarized Begin's books. Certainly many of the Palestinian groups in the 1960s, and Yasser Arafat used to say that the Palestinians were patterning their struggle on many of the same tactics and this appeal to an international audience that the Irgun sought. So, I mean, this is, I think, the important thing, too. It goes back to my point that, unfortunately, terrorists learn from one another, even from their enemies, and are constantly building upon previous experiences, which I think is one of the factors that has made terrorism so difficult to combat and to counter today, is that they're getting better, unfortunately, at what they do, and we're constantly reinventing the wheel and having to learn lessons all over again.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. You obviously write from a very academic perspective. I was wondering, you said that you had access to many different national archives. Whether or not you see those historical narratives that were very controversial back then reflected in the modern narratives of each country, whether or not they've stayed the same or have they evolved and changed in some way?
Well, the trouble is we don't often get access to official papers in any sort of meaningful, timely sense. I mean, right now, generally most countries follow a 30-year rule, so it's just documents now from the 1980s that are becoming available for consultation. What I think made the research in this more unique than other studies of this phenomena was something that I think is quite exceptional in the world, is that Britain makes available not all of its intelligence archives, but certainly the archives of its domestic intelligence service, MI5, the security service, are open to scholarly inspection. And I think correctly, many historians have noted that it's almost impossible to write history when you only have access to the diplomatic records or the military records or the social records, where in almost all cases the intelligence archives are closed. So Britain was quite unique in that all the documents on Palestine were available from the security service, and you can really understand on a daily basis not just how the government was making decisions and how they were responding to events in Palestine, but what the intelligence community was telling them. You also understand in an enormous parallel today, the main strength of the British government in combating the Jewish groups was signals intelligence, was their ability to intercept communications both in Palestine and outside of the country. Now that cut both ways. The British knew that a lot of their communications were also being monitored by the Irgun and by the Haganah and other groups. And at one point, the British decided to a very primitive form of encryption to speak in Welsh. And anybody who's traveled in Wales knows that, at least to English language speakers, Welsh is almost indecipherable. But no matter, before long, the Irgun had found some Jews who had grown up in Wales and were fluent in Welsh and were able to therefore translate and decrypt the British communications. But it's interesting what a huge role signals intelligence. In fact, throughout this entire period, the British were monitoring every communication out of Palestine by both mainstream official Zionist organizations. I mean, a lot of the surreptitious type of data mining that we talk about today, doing the exact same thing. All the communications of the more moderate, peaceful Zionists between Jerusalem and Washington and New York and London, all the capitals the British had access to, and had tremendous insight into exactly what was going on.
Hi. I wonder if you'd comment on bringing this to the modern time. It just strikes me when you were talking with the exact parallels to much of what ISIS is doing and to their declared goal of basically trying to be as provocative as possible in order to get a reaction that would alienate more and more of the Muslim community. And quite frankly, the way the Republican leadership, and to a lesser extent Hillary, are falling right into that trap of advocating, what was it, crews with patrols in the Muslim communities, and Trump keeping them out. But the point is, by overreacting, and they feed directly into it, and it's exactly the same thing that the Irgun and to some extent the Palestinians were trying to do as well, is to get an overreaction, and indeed that's what's happening to some extent in Israel today.
Well, I mean, that's why I think I place, Begin really is such an important role in modern revolutionary theory and conceptualization, because as I said, he was a skilled propagandist. And in the 1930s, the advent of radio, more mass communications that had hitherto existed, he precisely understood that power, and I think that is subsequently being translated, not least the strategy of provocation that you talk about. And again, it goes back to my point that terrorist organizations or underground movements, for their very survival, have to be learning organizations, have to avoid the mistakes that other groups made in the past. This is exactly the problem that you're illuminating, is that political leaders today are almost, in many cases, ignore history and ignore these lessons and don't understand that they're falling exactly into sometimes the provocations. I mean, look, what is terrorism about? At least when I have to reduce it, it's driving liberal societies to commit illiberal acts. And that's exactly what Begin was trying to do. In his strategy, he described turning Palestine into a glass house where the whole world would be looking in and every British step and misstep would be broadcast. And Britain, as a liberal democratic state, would be cast in carrying out, military operations reminiscent of the Nazis, at least in how it was portrayed. And what Begin sought to do was undermine the confidence of the British public and British leadership to arrive at some political solution in Palestine, and just to put pressure on the British to just leave. And this is, exactly what unfolded. So no, you're absolutely, the parallels to today are enormous.
Palestinians are doing exactly the same thing as the Israelis do all the provocation for house destruction and feed directly into the propaganda.
Well, I mean, think of the second Gaza war in 2014, right? And I was actually in Israel in June and July of that year. In June, Hamas entered into a power-sharing arrangement with the Palestine Authority, with their arch enemies, I mean, even more so than the Israelis. And it was because Hamas was bereft of funds, its popularity was declining, and the only way to remain in office was to forge an alliance with the Palestine Authority. Then you had the tragic kidnapping of the 3 Israeli teenagers and their murder. And what happens? Conflict immediately escalates, and the result of the conflict is the further marginalization of Israel in the international community. And Hamas emerges from being in very low popular esteem to being the heroes of having defended the Palestinian people. And it's harder to determine what to do, but I think it's fairly clear from the study of history to know what not to do.
Thank you. One of the last slides you showed before the lowering of the British flag was, I believe, the gallows room at the Akko prison. And so my question is, so in 1947, the British execute 6, 7, largely, I think, Irgun members, maybe 1 or 2 Lehi.
No, it was all Irgun.
It was all Irgun. The British had, up until that time, generally not executed the underground fighters. Shlomo Ben Yosef in 1938, the 2 assassins of Lord Moyne.
Right.
When they execute the 7 Irgun members in 1947, were they trying to kind of stem the tide of terrorism? I mean, was there hope that if they did this, maybe terrorism will stop? Was this some plan of theirs that maybe they could actually control terrorism through this action?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. I think often in these situations, government believe that acting tougher, that being harder on the terrorists will teach them a salutary lesson, will knock them into line. And it often, I think historically, actually has had exactly the opposite effect, that it's created martyrs where there may not have been martyrs before, has generated sympathy for the organizations. And that's precisely what happened in this instance. Britain thought that by getting tough that they would marginalize the Irgun, that they would make it less appealing to join their ranks. But the hangings of those 7s, firstly, they were broadcast throughout the world. It only underscored, again, an illiberal regime resorting to capital punishment. Some of those who they hanged, like Dove Gruner, had fought with distinction with the British Army during World War II. They were completely resistant to any pleas for clemency, and it did prove counterproductive. And if you read, the classic book of this is really Alistair Horne's A Savage War of Peace, which is about Algeria. And Alistair Horne, and that's actually, I humbly tried to write this book in very much the same spirit. Alistair Horne, though, was a much better writer. But he makes exactly the same point about the French in the 1950s. Up until the Algerian insurrection had been raging for 3 years, and the French hadn't subjected anyone to capital execution. There it was the guillotine, not the hangman's noose. And then in 1957, they decided that they would act tough and teach them a lesson. Completely polarized the situation, generated more sympathy for the FLN, the same as it had for the Irgun, that if these people were willing to die for this cause, even if people didn't agree with the tactics, there was something noble about them, something respectable, and it created sympathy for these terrorists where none had existed before. So that's the main part, but let me illuminate one other important dimension of this. During the Arab Rebellion, Britain had hanged 148 Arabs. So, as you just pointed out, the 2 Moyne assassinations were executed in Cairo. It was under Egyptian justice, had nothing to do with British justice. Until 1947, despite 3 intensely escalating years of Jewish violence, not one Jew, even though it was on the statute books that capital punishment was decreed not only for firing a weapon, mere possession of a bullet could earn you a death sentence. None had been executed. So the British also, in an attempt to demonstrate their equanimity, that they were being equal, that was another important reason that they decided to embark on the hangings. But the real reason is they thought that if they could be tough, they would teach a lesson that would dissuade people from joining the terrorist organizations. It had exactly the opposite effect. Let me make one point, too, is that interestingly enough, this isn't in Akko. I actually have, further on, I've got, there it is. I mean, that's the fortress Crusader Fortress that was one of the British prisons. That hangman's scene is actually from the central prison in Jerusalem. which is behind City Hall. No Jews were ever hanged there. 2 were scheduled to be hanged there, member of Lehi and Irgun, and they actually committed suicide the night before rather than perish at the hangman's noose. During the Arab Rebellion, Arabs were hanged there. But I have to say, if you're in Jerusalem, the 2 great museums of sort of resistance or underground movements, one is Kilmainham Prison in Dublin, where you go into the courtyard and you see the white crosses where Patrick Pearse and James Connolly were shot to death by firing squad. And the Jerusalem Central Prison is also a fascinating museum, completely recreated as it existed in the 1940s, also with the outline of the footprints on the hangman's trapdoor.
Thank you for the talk. I'm wondering what you would say the best response to terrorism would be if neither a changing policies or a strict response to terrorism seems effective.
Well, I mean, it's a much tougher question to ask in the abstract and to apply to, to every campaign. What I would say is that effective counterterrorism, which was repeatedly demonstrated in Palestine, is predicated on good intelligence, which in and of itself is dependent on relations with the law-abiding civilian population. And that was Britain's serial mistakes, is that they were very bad at their relations with the community. For instance, in the 1940s, they had only 2 members of the entire police force spoke Hebrew. So it meant when they captured terrorists, they had no means really to interrogate them, but they also had grave difficulties in communicating with the Jewish community and getting any sort of intelligence and information. There was a lack of cultural awareness as well. And they themselves, by their behavior, were viewed as occupiers, as an alien force, not as people attempting to maintain law and order to prepare Palestine for eventual independence. But unfortunately, they allowed themselves to fall into the trap because of their lack of familiarity with the local cultures, with the local languages, as appearing as an alien oppressive force, not as a force of democracy and of enlightenment, as they saw themselves. And this, of course, made their task exponentially greater. And I think this is a problem that we see recurrently, is in sometimes our frustration in countering terrorism, we're tough on the communities. I mean, paradoxically and counterproductively, rather than being tough on the terrorists. And we victimize and alienate precisely people whose support we need, but also haven't done anything wrong. We drive them into the arms of the extremists and into terrorism. And that, to me, is one of the timeless lessons from Palestine during this period, and unfortunately one that we see just in the past few days being suggested in this presidential campaign.
Thank you also again so much for your talk. I actually just want to touch on something you just said there, which I'm curious about. I'm wondering if you think it's possible to be both like an what you said, like an enlightening, democratizing force, while not being also one that's seen as like outside occupying. And like, how do you see the bridge between those two, if there is any?
Well, in the contemporary context, is not overstaying your welcome in a place, but also not leaving too soon. But in the context, let's say, of Iraq in particular, which I'm more familiar with, because I've only been to Afghanistan once, it was weakening the terrorists, establishing the conditions for stability, and one had hoped at various junctures for a democratic, truly representative government to take hold, and at least in my view, not leaving before that was achieved, and that was our mistake. So I think it's a very delicate balance. I mean, these days, unfortunately, with the very formidable and pervasive terrorist threats that we have, it's much more difficult to achieve than it was a decade ago. And that's one of the depressing things about Palestine, is that, throughout the history of British rule, each successive wave of violence made achieving any kind of lasting political solution exponentially more difficult. And we see that now today, that Iraq is it's a truism and an understatement to say that it's a far more complicated and fragile place today than it was 6 years ago.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions tonight. We have Professor Hoffman's books outside, so please feel free to stop by. Please join me in thanking Professor Hoffman.
Thank you.